Good to go.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Hank Childs from the University of Oregon. Thank you for calling into this ECP web tutorial. I'm going to present for just a couple of minutes talking about big picture in situ stuff. And then the presentation, the majority, almost all of the Ascent presentation will be by Cyrus Harrison and Matt Larson from Lawrence Livermore Lab. Cyrus, can we go to the next slide? And so this,
Yep. Oh, those are acknowledgements.
yeah, that's fine. So this is, of course, about Ascent, and Ascent does in situ processing. And when we say in situ processing, we mean that we're processing data while it's being generated. And so specifically, this means that you'd be taking your visualization and analysis routines, in this case, the Ascent library, and coupling it with a simulation code. The goal is typically to avoid file system I/O. I think it's pretty well understood that the exascale machine, that the I/O rate, the ability to generate data will be so much bigger than the ability to store data, and the traditional method of saving full time slices to disk at a high temporal rate won't work there. And so in situ processing is a way to sidestep that problem. Another really good thing about in situ processing is you can access more temporal data. And so if you want to do some lightweight analysis and visualization each time step, once you've integrated in situ code, then you can do that. And from our perspective, there's a lot of computational power available. And so we can do our algorithms much more quickly than we could otherwise. Things that are negative about in situ processing. So one centers around whether or not you have a priori knowledge of what you'd like to do. So if you do, great, and you can program that into an in situ infrastructure like Ascent and say you'd like to do this operation. If you don't know what you want to do, then it gets harder. And so one strategy is to have the in situ library direct the visualization itself. And so in that case, it wouldn't just need, for example, an ISO surfacing algorithm, but it would need another algorithm to pick the ISO levels and the camera positions and so on. Another con is the increased complexity. And so now there's a new dependency for a simulation code, a library, although Ascent has worked, I think, quite hard to make this increased complexity be as small as possible, both in terms of API and in terms of binary size and other issues. And another con is constraint, sharing resources, memory, etc. Next slide. And so the last thing I want to say is Ascent is part of a broader ECP ecosystem. So myself, Matt, Cyrus, we're all members of the ECP Alpine team. Alpine is responsible for delivering in situ infrastructure to the ECP app teams. We support 3 in situ infrastructures, Ascent, Catalyst, and libsim, but the majority of our activity has been through Ascent, the product that you're calling in to hear about. Alpine also has been working on new algorithms. So I mentioned on the previous slide, where to place a camera, what ISO levels should we choose to go into the ISO surfacing algorithm, how to direct that visualization. And also I didn't mention doing compression, but you can see ZFP compression there. So reducing data to a small enough form that you can explore it post hoc. And so all those things are available within Ascent, although some are being stood up right now by ECP. The last thing I want to mention about this slide is that we're partners with the ECP VTKM project, which is delivering visualization algorithms that will run on exascale hardware efficiently. And so everything you'll hear about today in Ascent is something that will run on the ECP machines. And with that, I'll hand it over to Cyrus and he can tell you more about Ascent.
Okay, thanks, Hank. So I'm Cyrus. I work at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and Matt and I have been working on Ascent for several years, and we're excited to present it to you here. So what is it? It's a library, right? It's a library that you use inside of a simulation code to do in situ visualization analysis. So we focused on a couple things in this effort. The first is to make things easy to use. So we wanted to focus on the primary use cases we thought for maybe a batch-based in situ. And we didn't want to really try to capture the long tail of every algorithm that existed. Although we have this as a way to deploy more complicated algorithms as well. But for a start, we just wanted to focus on saying, hey, people are going to want to make pictures, people are wanting to do ISO surfaces, all those things, and we wanted to make that easy. It's a young effort, it's a couple years old, but it already has a lot of the bread and butter. So again, not the long tail, but a lot of the bread and butter that you would need for doing your visualization operations. It gives you a simple infrastructure to integrate your own custom analysis into. So there's a way to register your own filters in a way that doesn't have to have you understand a very complex system. We provide C, C++, Python, and Fortran APIs. So all of those are very important to cover the various codes. So easy to use is one thing. The other thing is we wanted to have a flyweight design. So we need to be able to use the ECP hardware. We need to be able to use the resources as the simulation codes are using them as well. So to do this, we use a distributed memory approach, MPI, which is the predominant one. And then we also have a way of leveraging mini-core, so via either CUDA or OpenMP. And there'll be options for HIP and things like that in the future. So I'll talk about this in a little bit in the future, but we have scaled this across all of Sierra's LLML Sierra machine, which is currently the #3 machine. So using up to 16,000 GPUs embedded in a simulation code that was actually running on the GPUs as well. So we wanted to focus on lower memory requirements from other tools. So if you link in something like Visit, if you link in an in situ capability, Visit brings a whole lot in, and that can, I guess, provide memory pressure, and there already is memory pressure. You want to be able to use that memory for your simulation data, not necessarily for the resident program size. It also has a lot less dependencies, so it doesn't depend on system graphics libraries like OpenGL, which are notorious for being deployment pains, and we didn't want to really bring that pain into a simulation code itself. And we've also worked a lot to make sure that we can build this with SPAC, which is an important part of how ECP is deploying software. So I mentioned it's ready for common use cases. So the bread and butter type of things, the basic things that you do daily visualization are there. Things like clips, ISO volume, ISO contouring. So that's pulling out different parts of your mesh based on field values, things like thresholds, and of course rendering as well. So we can do pseudo color rendering or volume rendering, and also show you meshes. So this is just a snapshot of the common things that we have that are already ready to go. Hank mentioned that Ascent is part of the ECP ALPINE Ascent project. So, so it's supported by ALPINE, and it's also supported by Livermore's weapon simulation computing program. So Ascent is one of the major thrusts for infrastructure. And as Hank mentioned, the other major thrusts are algorithms. So we do want to have new in situ algorithms that help automate decision-making and keep the human out of the loop and make smart decisions about what data to select and save out, for instance. And that's actually a much bigger thrust, I think, of the ALPINE project than the infrastructure. So we're not going to talk about that much here, but the takeaway is that Ascent will be a way that we deploy those algorithms in the future to projects. So we've been working a lot to integrate and deploy Ascent with simulation codes. So these examples are for ECP. Obviously, ECP is a huge focus of us. So one of our strategies for doing this has been to work with the co-design centers. So with the Seed Co-Design Center, with technologies there, including InFem, we are, we've been working with Livermore's code called Marble, which uses InFem heavily. And also we have an initial implementation with the NEC-RS code. We've also worked a lot with the AMRX Co-Design Center, and there's several codes here which use AMRX. Also did a little bit of work with SW4. So I'll say if you're using one of these frameworks from the co-design centers, our goal here is that it's very easy. The data structures are already wrapped for you. So some of the stuff we'll cover in the tutorial today might not be of complete concern because you won't have to understand how to wrap your mesh structures. That's already been done in the framework. But just know we're trying to get the on-ramp to be the easiest as possible. So where there are shared capabilities, we can help invest and make sure that can be easy. A way to think about this is that, Ascent, it can provide pictures and things like that, but it's really, kind of a portal or a way to connect visualization, a bunch of different visualization analysis capabilities to our codes. So a lot of the capability that we have comes from BTKM, providing things like the slicing and rendering. These new algorithms from the ALPINE project will also be folded in. So things on this slide that say like anomaly detection, Lagrangian flow, those are all aspects of that. There is a way to actually connect with PairView as well. And there is a way to save out data. So you can write HDF5 files that things like Visit can pick up. So the goal is it's not going to necessarily replace all of your post hoc file-based workflows. But if you can get the data out more efficiently while you're running the simulation code, that should actually be, it should be a big win in terms of reducing overall I/O. Let me get this. Oh, it didn't show up again. we have a mysterious hidden picture that never shows up on this slide when we're in presentation mode. I'm sorry about that. So just a couple examples of where we've been using Ascent. So this is an interesting application where we're trying to basically there's a experiment here where they're trying to understand how a shock front evolves. And in this case, in real life, when they do these experiments, they use something called a visor, which can use as a laser to figure out the velocity at a moving surface. And we'd like to be able to, recreate that type of analysis to create a simulated, in our simulations, so we can compare with actual experiments. And using Ascent and some of the data binding capabilities in it, we're able to do this in a mesh agnostic way where we're able to reduce things and find the front of the advancing front, and then also sample the velocity along that, so we can make cool comparisons, or I guess comparisons that help us underpin our faith in the simulations and the experiments. So another example that we've been involved in is a result of, again, validating simulated results with experimental results. In this case, it's radiography. So this is an experiment that Matt loves to term big laser, tiny box, where we dump a whole bunch of energy into a very small box, and it develops an instability as part of that. And from the simulation, we would like to be able to get equivalent radiograph that we can compare to the radiograph in the real world. So here's some examples here. And Ascent was used to create those simulated radiographs. Another thing that's recent is with an in situ tool, you still need to iterate. And Hank had, described this at the beginning. You still have to have a way of iterating to understand what things you'd like to apply when the simulation is running to make it more effective. So one way we've been exploring doing that is using Jupyter Notebooks and using a Docker container, one which you will hopefully be using as part of the hands-on tutorial a little bit later today. And what we did in this case is we were trying to work with the WarpX folks to get all the slicing and cutting planes and renderings that they like to wrap their mind around their simulations and produce really nice visualizations. To do that, we saved out a very small, tiny data set. And then we used a notebook to iterate on all the descriptions of the things that they'd like to do. And that seems to be a pretty cool workflow that we would like to support more in the future. Finally, another case, which I mentioned earlier, is that we have scaled this up to quite a large scale. So using over 4,000 nodes and 16,000 GPUs on Livermore's Sierra system for a very large simulation code or simulation run. In this case, Ascent was running on the GPU via VTKM, and also the simulation code was as well. And this particular picture shows a snapshot where we did a clip and a rendering of that. And the simulation itself is an idealized ICF simulation where a Raleigh-Taylor instability develops. Okay, so what are we going to do today in our short time? So we want to teach you about Ascent, how, what its API looks like and what it can do. So a couple aspects of this. So you'll learn how to use conduit briefly, and that's the foundation of Ascent's API. We'll show you how to get simulation data into Ascent. So, if you have a mesh, how to describe it in a way that Ascent can understand it. And we'll also tell you how to drive Ascent, tell it, hey, I'd like these pictures, or I'd like to do this analysis. That's the plan for today. So the tutorial examples that we're going to go over are outlined in our documentation, and they're already also in every Ascent install that exists. And there's a couple of them there. I'll point out some of them. So if you'd like to get to this documentation, you can go to the website ascent-dav.org, and you can click on tutorial, and that will land you here to all the material that we're using today. All right, so to learn Ascent has 5 top-level functions. The ones that we're going to focus most on are publish and execute, but let me just talk about all of them quickly. So there's a pair of calls, open and close, and that's really initialization, right? Initialization and cleanup. So whenever you get things set up at first, you call open to make sure Ascent's ready to go. If you're running in an MPI context, this is where you would hand an MPI communicator, things of that nature. And you call close to clean up after yourself. So publish is where we pass our simulation data to Ascent. So whenever you'd like Ascent to digest some new mesh data, you call publish, and you hand it a description of your mesh so it understands and has the context to do the things it needs to do. And then there's also execute. Execute's where you tell Ascent the actions you'd like it to do. So I'd like you to please make a pseudocolor plot, for example. And then there's also an info function, which is handy for, well, getting lots and lots of details about what Ascent just did, I guess I will say. And we use this in our Jupyter interface to make sure that we can get context about what happened if there's errors, or even to understand what pictures were rendered, for example. So these methods all take a conduit tree. So what's a conduit tree? It's going to be important for you to understand the basics of that. So conduit's another project that started out at Livermore that allows us, or that we use to provide kind of simple APIs for in-memory data description and exchange. So the idea here is that you have a hierarchical context that humans can understand and organize things in, that you can describe arrays to, and you can describe arrays to without copying them. It also provides C, C++, Python, and Fortran APIs, and that's really where Ascent derives a lot of its support from. On top of that, Conduit provides some common conventions for exchanging data. In particular, meshes are important here. So you'll see a little bit when we talk about the Conduit examples. Conduit examples can just be arbitrary trees of information, but in order to understand something as a mesh, we have to have some conventions that say, oh, well, a mesh needs coordinates, it needs topological information, etc. So there's some rules that a conduit provides that allow us to validate that expectations are made. The final thing it does is it provides I/O interfaces for moving and storing data that's already described in this way. So allows us to do things like binary checkpoint restart or ship things around with MPI, since we already have this rich description of data. So Ascent uses Conduit really as the keystone of its API. So with it, we have our C, C++, Python, and Fortran interfaces. Conduit handles that aspect for us. We don't have to custom write those interfaces for new things that we add to Ascent. Conduit enables us to use YAML to specify Ascent actions, which is the most human-friendly way to do things currently. It's very, very easy to just type up a YAML file and ask Ascent what to do with that. I also mentioned that zero copy is important, and that the Conduit zero copy features allow us to get arrays from simulations without actually having to do extra data motion. And the blueprint's the thing that provides these standard conventions. So we use that to basically we use that as the way to present simulation meshes to Ascent. So learning Ascent means you have to learn a little bit about Conduit. So the tutorial focuses on that a bit, just enough to make you dangerous and able to use Ascent. So to start, I want to take a look in the slides at this first slide example in C++. And this is on our tutorial page. We're going to look at the C++ example, and then after that, we're going to switch to using Jupyter Notebooks, which actually show Python examples. So, but this is where you can find the this example, and all the sources are there as well. So to get started here, this is an example. So we use a toy mesh. So we have, the first thing we have is code that generates basically a built-in example mesh, populates this this node data structure with the hierarchy that describes a particular mesh that's an unstructured mesh that has some toy fields on it. From here, we want to create an Ascent instance, set it up. So again, that's the open call, and we're not using MPI here, so this is just very simple. We just call open with no options. And then we want to hand that mesh that we created to Ascent. So that's what publish does. So we hand it that conduit node, which has the information in it. In the tutorial in a bit, we'll talk about how to create, how to craft those meshes. But for this example, it's just to give you an overall understanding. All right. Now, telling Ascent what you would like it to do, or I guess asking Ascent for some help to make some pictures. That's a way to think about it as well. So this shows an example of using the C++ conduit API to basically provide a description of what we'd like to happen. We call those actions. for now, I think the best way to think about this is there's an equivalent YAML description of this, which is just a hierarchical name of, key and value pairs, or hierarchical set of key and value pairs. So in this case, we want to add a scene, which is one of the constructs in Ascent for making pictures. Here's our plots. We'd like to plot something called braid, which is one of the fields on our example mesh. And here is our, image name we'd like to be. So we'll have something called out first light render 3d.png or something like that at the end of it. Once we have those actions, we tell Ascent, please execute them, and we get a picture. So that gives you an idea of the basics here and the basic workflow for using Ascent. So the two big aspects of it are presenting your mesh data and then presenting it with the actions that you'd like it to execute. So as far as capabilities, so Ascent's interface provides 5 composable building blocks that we can use to get things done. So conceptually, it's important to understand these. We have examples for all these, and we'll get through as many of them as we can today. The first one, which is what, is the first thing you're pretty much always thinking about, is how do I make pictures? Scenes are the things that allow us to make pictures. Pipelines allow us to transform data. So that's things like clipping or ISO values or ISO contours, etc. Extracts allow us to capture data. So in the case of, this is kind of our portal to other tools, I guess I will say. So we don't want to have all the capabilities in Ascent, but it is important to still be able to write out HDF5 files that other things can digest, or maybe jump into a Python interpreter or jump into Jupyter, etc. Queries allow us to ask questions. So these can be summarization questions, what's the total mass of a field or something like that. And triggers allow us to adapt actions. And this is a very important capability for decision making in situ. If you want to keep a person out of the loop, what you'd like to do is you'd like to have a rich way of saying, please execute my analysis when something exciting or something important happens. And triggers are a way that we provide that allow you to basically add conditions onto queries for when you would like to execute further analysis. So our tutorial has examples for all of these. So for the remainder of the tutorial, we're going to run using some Jupyter Notebooks and do some examples there. And I think we're going to get you started, but I still have to connect a couple things up here. So, but for now, let me just show you, let me stop sharing this. Let me just show you a couple things. All right. Oops.
So Cyrus, while you're doing that, we have a couple questions going in the chat, which is fantastic. And I want to encourage folks to ask questions in the chat. I think I can answer the one from Arlie, but I'd actually like Matt to take a look. I'm 90% sure of the answer. So you keep going, Cyrus. We're filling time while you're setting up.
Sure. So I think it looks like we're probably good to go here. I just double checking a couple things. So let me share my screen again and just show you the process. All right. Okay, we're back. So can folks see my web browser here? We good?
We sure do.
Right. Okay, so if you go to ascent-dav.org/tutorial, you'll land on this page, and this page will be the place where you start to actually get a cloud server that's running our Jupyter Notebooks. It's running on AWS. So if you don't want to do this, or if you are a fan of Docker and an expert yourself, you should be able to, assuming your laptop or your desktop is similar to most out there, run using our container, which is published on Docker Hub through this command here. But if you're following along or you like to follow along, you can click here for a notebook server. When you get here, you click request a server, and it should land you on your own unique server here. So then that'll take one of those tickets out of the pile for other people. From here, you click on the URL, and you are in the server, and the password is learn, L-E-A-R-N. Now, if you're on VPN, it's possible that your corporate VPN might not allow you to connect to these weird AWS URLs. But if you have problems, I'll try to help you try to help you in a few minutes, but I do, in the interest of time, I think we want to show the first examples, and then I might be able to troubleshoot a little bit more whenever I hand it off to Matt for more of the fun stuff. But before I get started, are people able to get to this page? And are people able to, how is this working okay so far? Let's maybe.
Cyrus, I would have thought a link would have gone in the chat. I don't have the link in front of me.
Yes, that is a fantastic idea. Let me do that real quick, okay? Here we go. See if I can get the chat. Okay, start here. I do have a way I can, check how things are going, but I don't really want to do that while I'm sharing my screen. And again, in the interest of time, we have a short time period here. I want to start sharing the examples. So if you're able to follow along, great. Just know if you can't now, you could use Docker or you could talk to us afterwards and we could try to help you out with that. So let me just dive into the Jupyter examples here. I'm going to do a couple and then I'm going to hand off to Matt, and Matt's going to do some of the ones with more complicated features. So this we're running here is called Jupyter Lab. So it's one of the Jupyter interfaces. We're going to be running everything with Python 3. And if you're not familiar with Jupyter Lab, this is a file browser over here, and these are notebooks, and these notebooks encode, code and also comments and things like that we can use to execute kind of interactively. So I'm going to start by looking at the first one, which is called the first light, which is exactly the same thing that I just showed you from the PowerPoint slides. However, it's written in Python. So we'll do this a little quickly because we've already went over some of the concepts. So to get started, when you run these notebooks, you hit Shift Enter to actually execute a cell. Again, if you're not familiar, we can try to help you a little bit in the future here. So I'm going to import some of the basic imports for conduit and ascent. I'm going to create an example mesh. Is this big enough, or should I try to make it bigger, Hank? What do you think? Is it okay?
It looks fine on my screen.
Okay. All right.
And Cyrus, since we have you, we had a question about Docker not installed on someone's laptop and how long the server will be running. I think it's only for the day. Is that right?
So yeah, so you don't have to have Docker to click on these links that are hosted in the cloud. You only need Docker if you're going to run on your laptop. So for that web link, I pasted in there. It's just a web browser that you need. So you can just click on that and go, and you should land on a public, something that's running in the cloud and no dependencies required. Does that make sense?
So Cyrus, the question was, how long will those servers be available?
Oh, I see. Oh yeah. So they will be available for, maybe 30 minutes after we're done here, but we can help you get set up otherwise. So we don't keep them running all the time. So, but we could, let's talk afterwards if you want more time. There's also public installs on many LCF systems that you could use. So.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Please continue. Sorry to bother you, Cyrus.
No worries. We definitely want to answer questions. Okay, so we're going to create some example data. This is that example that comes with conduit that we call braid. And we're going to set up our actions here and ascend. So again, we open ascent. In this case, we're actually telling it that we'd like to forward all exceptions to the notebook so we can see what goes wrong. We're going to publish our mesh, and then we're going to ask it to make a picture, and that's this here. I'm just going to execute it here, and we'll see we have it printing out the equivalent YAML. So another way to provide this information is you could give it a YAML file, or there's a way to have a YAML string and just tell Ascent, here's what I'd like to do, using this YAML document. So in the Jupyter server, for Jupyter, we have a little viewer that gives us some basic output from our last render, which is handy. So we can use that to see the render that was created in this case. We can also use that to see the actions that were executed. And if something goes horribly wrong, we'll see something down here that says something went wrong. And that's the exact same example as our first slide example that we did in C++. I'll just close it down for now. So the second example is a very, very brief intro to how to use Conduit. And this is done in our C++, or we have examples for this for C++ and Python. We're doing it in Python here. But the best way to think about this and to wrap your head around it is that Conduit works like a hierarchical key value store. So the main thing is a node, which is this tree that holds this hierarchy, and you can dynamically create it. So in this example here, we have node key equals value, and if we print the YAML equivalent of that, oops, I forgot to import, sorry. If we print the YAML equivalent of that, we get something like this. So we have a key, and we have a value which happens to be a string with the letters value in it. So it supports hierarchical paths, and when you put hierarchical paths in it, this is interpreted as a tree-like structure. So here's an example. So, you know, for intuition here, thinking of it like a file system directory, you know, dir1, dir2, val1, it's a hierarchy in that, you know, that has that type of nature, I guess I'll say. So here's an example. We have a scalar, which is 100.5 at the end of this tree here. And yeah, and so if we print it, now you can see the hierarchy is reflected. So as far as leaves, I've already showed you, you know, strings can be leaves. All other leaves are actually bit width style numeric leaves. And so numeric arrays, kind of like NumPy, right? But that applies in C++ as well. So in Python, we do use NumPy as the way to connect things. So in this example, we create a NumPy array, and then we set that into a conduit node, which can hold it. And if we print this, so again, we're imposing some hierarchy here. We're giving it a name. It's a one-level hierarchy, but this is a very basic Fibonacci calculation. Last thing, but a very important thing, is that you can zero copy arrays. And the way this is done is with something called set external. So you can either set, which will copy, or you can call set external, which will not copy, but it will set up the conduit with a description of already allocated data. So in this example, we do a Fibonacci sequence again. The difference is we have two of them going, and one of them we're going to use a external or you know, shallow copied presentation, and the other one we're going to have conduit own it wholly. After that, we, you know, go to the original pointer, which is the NumPy array, and we change the value. And what we see is that when we change the shallow copy from the original pointer, we get, you know, the -1 happens, you know, happens to appear in our conduit node, and otherwise, well, conduit has a copy. So this is important. You may not be able to zero copy everything. So the conduit allows you to have different parts of the tree be, you know, zero copied or not. And then the other important aspects of this, once it's described, if you need to move it somewhere, well, then it's easy for conduit to copy it, even if it's externally, even if it's not copied yet. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're not doing too bad. All right, so the last example I'm going to cover, and then I'm going to hand it over to Matt, are examples of the mesh blueprint. So again, when we looked at the conduit examples, we saw that you can do whatever, you can create whatever tree you'd like to create. You know, you can, you know, create a, you know, forest of pine trees or what have you, right? So you can really describe anything you'd like to with this these hierarchical keys and you know, array leaves. However, whenever we want to do something with mesh data, well, we need to have more context than that. So to do visualization, we need to understand, you know, how things are associated with parts of our topological elements, all that stuff. So the mesh blueprint is the way that we do that, and the way that we present information to Ascent. And it's also something that we're using in Livermore for our simulation code. So we, for, you know, coupling things in between physics packages and things like this. So this isn't just for Viz, it's been through other, you know, other use cases as well. So I'm going to show you a couple basic grids. I will say the tutorial doesn't cover how to do things in the MPI case, but the MPI case is, it's very simple. You can think of the MPI case as you present chunks or domains things we're showing you, like right here, just multiple of them, and then it can parallelize over it. But if you're interested in that and it's not clear, we can help you after the fact. So let's get started here. I'm going to create first a uniform grid. So uniform grid's about the simplest type of mesh you can think about. So it's basically evenly spaced elements or evenly spaced zones. So let's take a look at this real quick and I'll describe what it's doing. So what the mesh blueprint needs is it needs a couple, I guess you would say, there's known names in the hierarchy that you need to provide, and then they follow some structure. So in this case, the first thing that we need to provide is a coordinate set. So that talks about, or that lets us know where the points in space are that describe our mesh. So in this case, we're going to use a uniform coordinate set, and we're going to tell it, it's a three-dimensional grid. We're going to tell it logically it has 9 points per dimension. We're going to give it some origin. The origin here tells you where it's anchored in space. And then we're going to give it some spacing, right? So that's each one of these elements will take this dx, dy, z, etc. After we have a coordinate set, we define a topology. So topology in this case is implied, it's implicit from the coordinate set here, because we can define a topology on a uniform set of points. These names are kind of important here. So the way we connect entities in the blueprint is by providing names. So here we are saying we have a topology, and it's called topo, that's our name. And it's defined on chords, which happens to be this name that also exists in the tree. Once we have the topology, we can provide fields. So we create a sample field here that just has some alternating values on it. So let me, and I actually zero copied the field data here. So if I print this, you can see the YAML representation. So, this tree structure is what we look for and what we validate. And then we happen to have, a big array that has a bunch of values on it. It's important that we make it easy to know if this is correct or not. So we provide this verify method. The verify method goes through and says, well, I expect the mesh to have these particular things. If I don't find that, I'm going to tell you why. So in our case, we've done a good job, and our mesh verify is successful. But if I made a typo somewhere, for instance, if I had chords typo instead of chords, as you can see here, if we go here, we'll get a lot of information about what went wrong. And you can do this. This is obviously at runtime in Python, but you can do this at runtime in C++ and all those things too. So we get this detailed information that says, hey, we don't have type for the coordinate set. That's something we expect. And these conventions are all documented on the conduit documentation as well. So let me go back to not having a typo. Okay, so now that we've created our mesh, let's make a picture of it with Ascent. So, so this is what we saw before. So I'm going to add a scene, and I'm going to tell it, please make a picture of my alternating field, which is what we created. And here's what we get. So, so that's we have a uniform grid, and we have this alternating pattern that's strided in a particular way across the grid. Second example, so example of creating an unstructured mesh. So an unstructured mesh is a little bit more complicated. We're providing explicit topology and explicit points in space. So in this case, our coordinates are, a list of XYZ pairs effectively. We have them all as independent arrays here that we publish in zero copy in. From there, we define the topology to be tetrahedra, and we use this is how we do that, by saying our mesh elements have the shape, and then we provide connectivity. So the connectivity here is going to create 2 different tets. So, and we put 2 fields on this. There's 2 tets here, and we really have a very simple field values here. So one has 0, 1, one has 1, 0 flipped on the 2 tets. So here's what that mesh structure looks like. So, the hierarchical YAML representation. Let's make sure we didn't make any mistakes. So far, we're good. And let's make a picture of this. So here we go. So here's an example of our tets that we created. So the final one, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into detail here, but it's really just an example of showing and using Ascent to render something that's time varying. So effectively, we are taking the built-in braid example that comes from conduit, and we're perturbing one of its fields, you know, to make it look a little bit more like time varying simulation data. So there's this function here really just helps us modify the sample data. And we start by creating the sample data, and we have a loop that loops over that and you know, updates the field each time and renders it. So I'm gonna just execute this, and it's running. And at the end, we'll look at the set of output files that are produced. And this is going to be where I hand over to Matt. So Matt's probably ready already, but if not, just a primer for him. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone have any questions at this point while we're waiting for this? Okay, it's done. All right, so here's our output, and we can just loop through all the pictures here. I mean, we could play it if we wanted to as well. Again, just an example of kind of what the workflow might look like a little bit more in a simulation code. We have where we're updating and publishing the mesh each time and asking it to execute. All right, so it looks like no one's raising their hands. Hopefully folks are able to actually get onto the Jupyter stuff without any problems. I'm gonna assume if they haven't been able to, I'm gonna assume that please bug me. I'll be happy to help. I think we're gonna hand over to Matt now. Matt, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, so go for it.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
That's good.
Okay, so we're going to go over the fourth Jupyter example. So this is basically covering how to generate some pictures using the Ascent action. So, you know, the scenes are just a way of generating images, and we're going to start off by using the example of the two tetrahedron mesh from the blueprint example 2. So, as always, you have to kind of do the import stuff to make everything work. This is just now a compact representation of pulling out the conduit mesh, and then we're going to move on to how to describe a scene. So, you know, we have a set of actions, and for each type of action we have sort of an add scenes action or an add transforms action. So here we're going to add a scene, and we're going to create two plots. So the first plot is a pseudo color plot of var1, and then we can specify an image name for the scene, which is right here, and then we're going to add the second plot of the variable 2. And render those images. So you can go through this. Of course, I missed something. And we can see it's going to show us both of these images. So this is the var1, and I think var2 is just the exact opposite of that. So we got it to produce two images of different variables on the mesh. Okay, so the second example is actually using multiple plots in a single scene. So one plot is a pseudo color plot, and then we actually want to render a mesh plot on top of that so we can see the outline of the mesh of the tetrahedrons. So before we had two different scenes. In this example, we have a single scene with multiple plots. We have, usually these conduit trees are a series of kind of reserved words and and user-defined words. So in this case, we're naming it S1 and we're naming it the plot P1, but plots and types are things that Ascent looks for. So just going through this, we have now the plot of var1, and we can see the output or the outline of this mesh here. So if you wanted to go back and sort of play with this, we can actually just not use the var1 and it'll generate another image, and now we just see the outline of the mesh. So that's an example of how these plots are composed together. Okay, so we generally provide a useful camera angle by default. So we generally create a camera position based on the bounds of the mesh and try to make sure that the full scene is in view. But we have we give you full access to the camera parameters, and then we try to make it as easy as possible. So in this case, we're going to do the same plot of the pseudocolor of var1. And we're going to change two camera parameters, or we're going to actually create two different images from this single plot. So renders specifies a list of images that you want from a plot, or excuse me, from a scene. And so here we have R1 for one image and R2 for another image. We give them separate names. Now we're going to give you access to, or show you an example of two different ways to change the camera. So azimuth is a way of sort of moving around the equator of the image from the default location. And then zoom is exactly what you think about. It's going to zoom in the camera so everything's bigger. So moving through the action. So here we moved, around the equator to the right. So now we have sort of a off-center image. So before we were facing directly at it. And then the zoom camera, you can move between the two of them, and then you can zoom out as well. So, we could change this to, actually let's do a little bit more extreme, change it to 30. And you can see that we've rotated even further around the equator. So things like azimuth, and we also provide a camera parameter elevation, which will move you up and down, so towards the North and South Pole. They're very useful for in situ because it doesn't require you to know the exact position of the camera, and sort of gives you an adjustment to the camera relative to where your mesh is. So if you have a moving mesh, it's super useful not to try to figure out where your mesh is at any given time step, and these relative parameters are very convenient. So the fourth scene example is changing the color table. So up until now, we haven't been specifying a color table, and we've been using the default color map, which is cool to warm. And so so each plot has a color table parameter, and we have a number of built-in color tables. And so you can go to the Ascent documentation and see a list of the color tables. In fact, I'll just kind of give you an example. We have a lot of examples. These are all the available color tables that you can use, so they're very convenient to go reference. So in this case, we're using Viridis, and we're going to create a second. So we have one plot of var1 and another scene and another plot using var1, but a different table, Color Inferno. And then so we'll see what the result of this is for each of the two images. So here is the first color table, and then here's the second color table. Again, it's poorly chosen because it's a black background, and there is black in the color table. So you can also change the background color and the foreground color. So foreground color is the color of the text and the bounding box access annotations. So if you switch the background, you probably want to switch the foreground too. All right, so we're going to move on to the pipeline example. So pipelines, in a sense, like Cyrus said, are a way of transforming the data. So in the previous example, the scenes were rendering basically the entire mesh. And in this case, we're going to perform some number of operations on them. And, so we're going to use basically a sort of a subset or transform subset of the data. So in the first example, we're going to create a contour. So pipelines, just like scenes, are just a list of things to do. And in the case of pipelines, you list things in order of which they'll execute. So, in this simple example, we're only going to transform the data once by creating a contour. Here are the contour parameters. We can either give it specific ISO values that you'd be interested in, or we can automatically create some number of ISO values based on the scalar range of the current time step. So we create the pipeline that does the contour, and then we want to make a picture of it. So The only difference between the scenes before, or the examples that in the previous Jupyter Notebook and this one, are we have the pipeline parameter, which means we want this picture to consume the output of this pipeline. So pipeline that performs the contour, and we'll take a picture of that. So you can see the example here where we did produce two contours, so pretty close together, so they kind of look like they're on top of each other. But we have a picture of the contour that we're looking for. So the next example, we're actually going to combine multiple transformations. This is sort of a way to do multiple transformations on your data. So in this case, we have a pipeline. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to threshold. That means remove all cells that are not within this specified range. So we're looking for all cells that contain values of 0.0 to 0.5. Once we have the results of that, we're going to clip away some cells that are within this sphere. So we're going to create a sphere at the origin with a radius of 12 and remove all cells within that sphere. And then again, we're going to make a picture of that. And of course, you have to consume the results of the pipeline that did the transformations. So here's the results of the threshold and the clip. We have the threshold creates sort of like a Minecraft output where you just have blocks of cells. And then you can see that the sphere has been removed from the center of the data set. All right, so the third pipeline example is creating and rendering multiple different pipelines. So in this case, we're going to have two different pipelines, each performing a set of transformations. So this is just a combination of the previous two examples. So we have a contour and then a threshold, contour in pipeline 1 and a pipeline 2 with the threshold and the clip, and we'll see the results of that. So not a super useful visualization, but it does show you how to combine the results of two different transformations into a single plot. Okay, extract example. So within Ascent, extracts is sort of a way of capturing data for use outside of Ascent. So this could be, sending data to Python. It could be doing I/O. In this case, we're gonna save out some HDF5 files of the mesh. So again, we're gonna just create the braid example. And so just like add scenes and add pipelines, we have add extracts. In this case, the type is called relay. The format we want to save it in is blueprint mesh HDF5. And this is basically going to save out all the different fields of the data set. And so you can see that it does create a file on the file system. And this is an HDF5 file that can be, actually can be read in by both Ascent and Visit, and hopefully other things in the future. Using Ascent, you can actually convert it to anything you want. So you could, save a file in this manner and then use Visit to convert it to something like VTK. So another useful thing to do with I/O is only saving out a subset of the mesh. So your mesh might have 100 fields on it, but you're really only interested in looking at density after the fact, which is a very large data reduction. So for the relay extract, we can provide a list of fields. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say, of all the fields in the mesh, I only want you to save out the ones in this list. And so here's the YAML representation of that list. Really not so much to show here, but normally I could open this up if this wasn't in a Docker container and then demonstrate that there's only one field on Visit. And so in addition to saving out the whole mesh or a subset of the fields on the whole mesh, we can save the results of the transformations. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to connect up a pipeline of the contour filter to the HDF5 file. And so it looks exactly like the other examples. So we're going to create the filter with the specified ISO values. And then just like when we wanted to render the results of a pipeline, the extracts can consume the results of a pipeline. And here we just add the pipeline parameter, and the only thing that will be saved to disk will be the results of the contour filter. Okay, so I'm running low on time. We can also do cinema databases. So a sort of a cinema extract is, it actually works through the rendering, so that through the add scenes mechanism. And so the idea behind cinema is, you know, saving out many, many images as a form of data reduction. So you can, I'm just going to start rendering images because it might take a second. But what it will do is it'll create a database of images from a number of different camera angles, and you can, you know, move the camera around. Normally, you can, you know, you would move around in like azimuth and elevation, and you could actually, there are viewers that you can kind of click and rotate the image as if you were doing a post-hoc exploration. But it basically creates a cinema database that can be read by a number of different things for kind of post-hoc exploration of the data. Oh, and we do have a small version of the moving the phi and theta. You can also move through time, except there was no time. We can change the image size. So I will briefly go through the the query examples, which is an example of asking questions of the data, and then you can actually look at that data after the fact. So just like we had add queries and add pipelines, add scenes, add extracts, we have add queries. And this gives you a mechanism for asking questions about the data. So we have a custom query language that's very Python-like, and we can ask questions like, what is the cycle? And we can give it a specified name. We can ask more complicated things like, I want to take the histogram of a field, and I want the entropy of that histogram. And then, please save that data for later. You can actually access this from the simulation. But for now, we're just going to look and see what the output is. So as it's, this is a time varying simulation. So we'll get a data, sort of a curve through time if it's a single value. And the end result of this is, a YAML file that's on the file system that contains a time history of the answers to your questions. So in this case, this was the entropy. So you can look at the entropy over time. And so it's very convenient to have this in sort of a YAML file because you can do post-processing in Python. Here's just an example of the images that it produced. And then so here's an example of using Python to plot entropy over time. And we have a lot of users who are sort of interested in this for kind of custom analysis. You can think of the query language as a way to kind of normalize the data. So you don't really have to understand what the underlying mesh representation is, and you can ask questions regardless of what type of simulation you're running. So we're at the top of the hour. I don't think I'm gonna have time to cover the other examples. So I think this gives you a good idea about some of the capabilities. I encourage you to, if you want to see examples, these are sort of like templates that are generated from our our test suite that give you examples about how to set up, a number of actions or specific pipelines. So, if you want to create an ISO volume, we have templates for that, and then it shows you the results of those things. So, I encourage you to check out the documentation. It has a lot of useful examples that if you're playing with Ascent, it's a good starting spot. So
thanks, Matt.
With that,
yeah. Sorry I crowded out your time a little bit. Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you, Hank, as well. So, yep, I think we're at the end of time here, but happy to answer any questions if people have any. Should be able to track us down as well. I think if you go to Ascent-DAV, there's a contact email there, or you should be easy to find Matt, myself, or Hank to get in touch with us. So thanks very much for joining us today. Hope everything worked out. If not, let us know. Like to know what if things went wrong, so we could try to improve the tutorial. And if you're interested in wanting to contact us more high bandwidth or have us describe things to you, we'd be happy to set up a telecon or webcon, what have you. Just reach out. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cyrus. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Hank. Thank you all, folks, for joining us today.